Well, thank you. I appreciate it, and I will say at the beginning, Mr. Sepru said that this is a session for discussing pain. I don't have any pain. I mean, insofar I am a middle-class white kid originally from Seattle, so I come to this as an outsider entirely. However, I am a kid that has cared about America, about the oppressed around the world my whole life. From Seattle is a guy who died when I was a baby, but his name was Senator Scoop Jackson. He was a hero of mine, is a hero of mine. He spent most of his life in politics. He was a middle-class kid from the suburbs. He became a senator, and he spent most of his time standing up for the rights of the oppressed in the context of the Cold War. I look up to him as my hero, and I'm not a senator, and I seriously doubt I will ever become one. I try in a small way to stand up for the rights of the oppressed around the world. To what I do personally, the Middle East Forum is where I work for, is my employer. That's who I work for. And as you might notice, the Middle East is not South Asia. It is a different place. It is not all that far, but it's different and it's distinct. How did I get involved in this? Well, a few years ago, one of my coworkers, who is an expert in radical movements and an expert in sort of how these movements work, started noticing something that should have been noticed, frankly, by people like us a long time ago, but for various reasons was not. And that is that various Islamist groups that have their roots in South Asia were increasingly vocal in Europe, and especially in America, in ways that were influencing our politics. And he went to me and said, hey, look, we need to do something in Washington about this. I should start with one other thing here. When I speak of Islamist groups, what I'm not speaking of is Muslims. What I'm not speaking of is the vast majority of American Muslims or Muslims abroad or anywhere else. When I speak of Islamists, I speak of people that see no greater good than theocracy, of their own narrow interpretation of Islam and the absolute rule of that narrow interpretation. Those people do not represent all or most Muslims at home or abroad. Unfortunately, they are oftentimes the most organized, both at home and abroad, and that gives them disproportionate power. In any event, so when it comes to these groups have, as I mentioned, are the best organized, and they have power, and they have the veneer both of ethnic and religious authority in them, that they try to cloak themselves in that. So when congressmen or senators or even people in the State Department or Defense Department or have you try to understand this of the regions, way too often they look to these groups, even though these same groups do not necessarily have the best interests or the interests at all, frankly, of the people involved. That is how we got involved in some of these fights. So, what are you up against, I guess, is the next issue. As I mentioned, the Middle East Forum predominantly deals with the Middle East, and there are numerous lessons to be learned here, and numerous factors that affect what you guys are talking about here. For decades, largely, but not exclusively, because of the Israel-Palestine conflict, there have been groups that are commonly associated with different stripes of radicalism from the Middle East that have grown up around that conflict and grown up around that point of view. And they are influential in lobbying Congress in trying to represent their version of Islam and their theocratic tendencies, I would argue, as being the mainstream of Islam, as being what these people want and what is best for the people of the region. And they have a constituency. They're not the majority, but they have a constituency, and they get things through. Now, here's the difference. Everybody on Capitol Hill, a couple blocks from here, in the House and Senate office buildings, knows or think they know what they think about Israel-Palestine. They know or they think they know what they believe about the Middle East, about Saudi Arabia or Egypt or Iraq. Bluntly, and this might be funny, but it's also true, most of them think that Kashmir is a song by Led Zeppelin. They know nothing about it. So the point is, the first thing they hear about it is what they tend to believe. Why wouldn't they? They don't know anything else. So, a couple of years ago, not long after Article 370 was abrogated, we had a hearing on human rights in South Asia in the subcommittee, in the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee. Ilhan Omar, a Somali Muslim woman that was immigrated here, sought a special waiver to speak at this committee. Why? Because she had any expertise on South Asia? No. Somalia is 2,500 miles away from India. And moreover, she spent most of her life living in the US. No, she sought it because she has taken it on herself to represent the rights, the point of view, that is, of Islamist groups, not majority Muslims, but Islamist groups. She came here and talked to a reporter who was a Kashmiri Pandit, a Kashmiri Hindu, who had come to testify on the history of her people and the plight of her people. And she sought to demonize this woman based essentially on an article that, articles have been written by a group called Stand With Kashmir. There was an article written just a couple days before she came out. It's actually funny if you look at it. It came out like 2-3 days, I think, before the hearing, how much her talking points lined up almost exactly with what this article was saying. She was just reciting what was being fed to her, essentially. Now, who is Stand With Kashmir? Stand With Kashmir is a group that popped out of the ground sometime magically between, at the beginning of 2019, 2018-2019, and they're made up of academics and activists that have far left and Islamist points of view. They are frequent partners of the Islamic Circle of North America. Who is the Islamic Circle of North America? According to even left-wing scholars in major universities such as Johns Hopkins, just a few miles from here, they are the Western face of Jamaat-e-Islami. Singh mentioned, their role in some of this. That theocratic group in that region that seeks to impose Islamic law. Stand With Kashmir openly celebrates activists and jihadists from Hizbul Mujahideen. They tweet things when one of them got taken out by Indian security forces. When a terrorist got taken out by Indian security forces, they tweeted about how he was murdered by Indian security forces. No mention of the fact that Hizbul Mujahideen is a group that, for example, literally gang raped and sawed a young woman in half decades ago. That they still do things like this to this day. No mention of that at all. Stand With Kashmir is also partnering with numerous other Islamist groups all around the country to paint a narrative of what is going on in Kashmir on a blank slate, because very few know about it. I'm not an expert in the region, and I don't pretend to be. However, just to show you kind of a small example of the kind of thing I'm talking about, there's another group that is also sort of a Jamaat-e-Islami franchise, if you were, called Sound Vision. There's a media and company that is dedicated to sort of promoting this point of view. One of the head honchos wrote an article not that long ago discussing Kashmir, and she made a bunch of really wild claims about the Indian security forces massacring 100,000 Kashmiris. And she also, and after saying 100,000, she said there have also been, and I might be making up this number slightly, but I believe she said there was 10,283 rapes, so some very specific number, which was just bizarre. And I went and looked it up. I'm like, where did this number come from? Well, if you kind of peel back the onion a few layers, she didn't have a link, she didn't have a study, she didn't mention, you find out she's citing a number from a Pakistani propaganda website that's like 20 years old. This is the kind of information that is being put out there. Now, look, you don't have to agree with every single thing the Indian government has done or every action the security forces have taken to realize that these are not numbers being presented in good faith. This is not a narrative that is based in reality. This is a narrative that is trying to reach a goal. It is trying to establish something. It doesn't stop there. It's not that. It gets much worse, I would argue. Imran Khan gave a speech to a conference, the Islamic Society of North America. This is distinct from the Islamic Circle of North America. It's a different organization. Unlike the Islamic Circle of North America, which at least has some ties to South Asia, bad ones, but ties anyway, Islamic Society of North America is based out of the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood out of South Asia. Why did Imran Khan want to give a speech to them? Well, because he recognizes what I said earlier, that because of the fights over Israel, Palestine, other issues in the Middle East, this group has an established network in the United States, and if he can co-opt that for his purposes, he can influence what happens in Kashmir. And he can influence what happens in Afghanistan, what happens to his own country. And increasingly, you are seeing these different types of actors, Muslim Brotherhood, Jamaat-e-Islami, their various friends and enablers, working together towards the same goal. And working together using the same kind of tactics of, shall we say, light on the facts, heavy on the narrative, ignoring any inconvenient facts, not even acknowledging any of the history or complexity of the region, aimed at dismissing the concerns of Kashmiri Hindus and the Kashmiri Pandits, of ignoring the wishes of the everyday Kashmiri Muslims, of seeking only a rule of Islamists rather than the average person, the average Indian Muslim. So the point is simply this, is that at the end of the day, I think India has a tough time on its hands going forward. Not because they are wrong on the fundamentals, I don't think they are, but because, frankly, they are behind in sort of creating a political ecosystem that gets its message out in a meaningful way. It should not be all that hard to knock down some of the hysterical claims that, there are daily massacres of, thousands of Kashmiri Muslims. You don't even have to love most all of what the Indian government does to not realize that is just ridiculous. But these are the kinds of claims that get made every day, and there's an audience for it, and there's a network built in to create it. And what's more, you also face a separate problem, as has been alluded to by our Afghan friends, and that is sort of America's war weariness. My hero, Senator Jackson, he fought the Cold War when nobody else wanted to fight it. He spent basically all of the 70s trying to drag both parties into confronting the evil of the Soviet Union. Right now, America is, I don't want to use the word exhausted. In many ways, it is just tired of dealing with the problem. The public is tired of dealing with the problem because they don't understand it. And our leaders, too many of them, are too unwilling to say the truth. Everybody that pays attention to what's going on in Afghanistan, I think, knows the kinds of things that our friends here have told us. They know how bad it is. We're not losing a war because the situation on the ground is bad. America hasn't taken a casualty in Afghanistan since February of 2020. Not one. We're losing to a political slogan. Endless war, even though we only have a few thousand guys essentially acting as a tripwire and coordinating a few strikes against bad guys. But the point is that isolationist streak hurts Afghans, it hurts India's interests, and it hurts our ability to have better relations and stronger relations and more meaningful relations with that part of the world. And so I hate to be depressing. I do not think the situation is hopeless. I think that America goes through isolationist streaks. I think it has movements that flare up and die down once they get exposed for being as hollow as they are. I think that's common throughout American history. But I don't underestimate the size of the challenge, because the opponents of classical liberalism, the opponents of human rights, the opponents of equal rights between different religions and ethnic groups, between people that want peace and the people that just want rule of their own. They want some form of theocracy or dictatorship or some hybrid thereof. They're better organized and they're dedicated. So it's going to be a long fight. And I think that at the end of the day, recognizing that and being willing to push back against those who are dedicated to their theocratic vision. We need to be just as dedicated to a pluralistic, liberal vision of justice for all.
Thank you.